Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 09, Episode 07. Tonight we delve into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern World History to unravel the early decades of the Cold War, a period where ideological clashes pushed the world to the brink of nuclear confrontation. Our mission today is really to cut through the complexity of your source material, specifically Lowe's comprehensive text, and pull out the most important insights. We want to help you truly understand how this whole global confrontation kicked off and, well, why it got so dangerous so fast.
And that really sets the stage, doesn't it? This massive shift from wartime allies fighting shoulder to shoulder to bitter adversaries. Lowe's text helps us tackle that core question. How did the post-World War II alliance just unravel? We'll look at the key events, sure, but also the really fascinating shifting ideas about who was actually to blame.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. Lowe calls it the seeds of conflict. And it's interesting, you might think allies trust each other, but even before World War II, Stalin had this deep conviction. He genuinely believed capitalist powers would always try to destroy communism in Russia.
Right. And, the German invasion in 41, in a grim way, probably felt like proof to him. So for a while during the war, yeah, the USSR, USA, Britain, they were united. But it was sheer self-preservation, wasn't it? Against Germany and Japan. They sort of papered over the huge ideological cracks because, well, they had to.
But Lowe makes this crucial point. The moment Germany's defeat looked certain, that unity just started to crumble fast. Both sides, maybe Stalin especially, were already planning for what came next, and those old suspicions, they came roaring back.
Exactly. Stalin's thinking after the war was all about using that Red Army advantage. He wanted to solidify Russian influence, grab German territory, take land from neighbors like Finland, Poland, Romania. And Lowe points out he was actually incredibly successful at this, often locking things down before any formal treaties were even signed. It wasn't just about land, though. It was about creating a buffer zone, protection, rooted in this deep historical fear Russia had of invasions.
Yeah, but the West saw it totally differently, didn't they? From their viewpoint, this wasn't defensive. It looks like straightforward Soviet aggression, like a plan to spread communism everywhere, this clash in perception. It's so key in Lowe's analysis.
Absolutely. And that perception, it was definitely fueled by the change in U.S. leadership.
Yeah.
During the war, you had Roosevelt. He sent Lend-Lease aid, supplies, weapons. And he seemed, well, maybe more willing to give Stalin the benefit of the doubt. But then Roosevelt dies in April 45. Harry Truman takes over. And the U.S. stance, it gets much, much tougher. Truman was deeply suspicious of Soviet motives.
And Lowe brings up this really provocative idea that some historians think Truman dropping the atomic bombs wasn't just about beating Japan, because maybe Japan was ready to surrender anyway, but it was also about sending a message, a huge, terrifying message to Stalin about American power. Like, look what we have.
And that just fed right into Stalin's existing paranoia. He already felt the West had deliberately delayed the Second Front, the D-Day landings in France. He thought they did it on purpose, to let Russia bleed fighting Germany. Then finding out about the bomb only right before they used it and being shut out of occupying Japan, it just confirmed his worst fears. The power imbalance was stark. The West had the bomb, the Soviets didn't. Simple as that, for a time.
That shift in perception, that growing distrust, it really shows the Cold War wasn't just about, tanks and treaties. It was about what each side thought the other was doing. And Lowe does a great job showing how historians have wrestled with this. So how did they try to answer that question? Who started it?
Well, the early view, the traditional view, let's call it, was very common in the West in the 50s. People like George Kennan, an American diplomat who'd been in Moscow, he and others basically put the blame squarely on Stalin. They saw his motives as purely expansionist, trying to spread communism, destroy capitalism. And Kennan's advice led to the policy of containment, essentially draw a line, stop Soviet influence from spreading.
Yeah.
Politically, economically, diplomatically.
Right, and so from that perspective, things like forming NATO or America getting involved in the Korean War in 1950, that was just self-defense, purely reactive.
That was the narrative, yes. A pretty clear-cut good guys versus bad guys story at the time. It really shaped how people saw things. But then, starting in the 60s, early 70s, you get the revisionist view. This came from Soviet historians, but also some Americans, and they flipped it. They argued, no, you can't blame Stalin. Look at Russia's losses in the war, 20 million dead, maybe more. Utter devastation. So Stalin wanting friendly neighbors, a buffer zone, that was purely defensive. Understandable, even given how weak Russia was in 1945. They argued there wasn't actually a real Soviet threat to the West.
And some American revisionists, like William Appleman Williams, went even further. They said the U.S. should have accepted a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, They argued that American politicians, especially Truman, were the ones who provoked Russia unnecessarily. And this view, it gained traction, didn't it? Especially during the Vietnam War, when lots of Americans started questioning U.S. foreign policy. Was America always the good guy? Had its hostility maybe helped cause the Cold War?
Exactly. The revisionists argued the U.S. was trying to use its atomic monopoly, its huge industrial strength, to basically dominate the world. So for them, the blame shifted heavily onto the USA.
Okay, so two very different takes. But then later on, in the 80s, we get the post-revisionist interpretation. This sounds like a middle ground.
It is, yeah. And crucially, it benefited from access to new documents, archives opening up in Russia and elsewhere, things earlier historians just didn't have. And what this new evidence suggested was, well, it was more complicated. Both sides shared some responsibility. For instance, yeah, American policies like the Marshall Plan, that huge aid package for Europe, probably did have a political motive, increasing U.S. influence, not just humanitarian aims.
Okay, but what about Stalin? Did the post-revisionists let him off the hook?
Not entirely, no. They generally concluded that while Stalin might not have had some grand master plan for world conquest, he was definitely an opportunist. If he saw weakness in the West, he'd push. He'd try to expand Soviet influence. And the way the Soviets installed communist governments in Eastern Europe, it was often brutal, very heavy-handed. That certainly looked like expansionism, whatever his deeper motives were.
So the post-revisionist idea is kind of tragic, almost.
In a way, yes. It suggests both the U.S. and the USSR were locked into their positions full of suspicion. Each side saw its own defensive moves as necessary, but viewed the other side's defensive moves as aggressive. This mutual distrust, this spiral of fear, rather than one single villain, that's what led to the Cold War, according to this view.
It's a really helpful way to think about it. Okay, let's track how this actually unfolded. How the Cold War took shape between, say, 45 and 53. Lowe guides us through those early conferences, Yalta, Potsdam. They started with hope, but ended in division.
Yeah, Yalta, February 45. On the surface, it looked pretty successful. Agreements on the UN, dividing Germany and Berlin into zones, promises of free elections in Eastern Europe. Stalin even agreed to fight Japan eventually for some territory.
But the cracks were already showing, right? Like over Poland.
Poland was a major red flag,
Yeah.
definitely. The Russians had already set up their own communist government there, ignoring the Polish government in exile in London, and they couldn't agree on Poland's western border.
And then Potsdam, just a few months later, July 45, the mood was much colder.
Oh yeah, Truman was there instead of Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Attlee replaced Churchill halfway through. They couldn't agree on Germany's long-term future at all.
Yeah.
And Poland was still the big sticking point. Russia basically controlled the eastern part, installing pro-communist Poles.
And Truman didn't tell Stalin the full details about the A-bomb until right before Hiroshima. That must have deepened the mistrust hugely, made it clear Russia wasn't needed to beat Japan and wasn't going to get a say in occupying it.
Absolutely. And in the months after Potsdam, the Soviets systematically tightened their grip on Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, Romania. Pro-communist governments installed, often by dubious means. Opponents imprisoned, or worse. In Hungary, communists got less than 20% in free elections, but somehow ended up dominating the government.
Then came Stalin's speech in February 46, declaring communism and capitalism couldn't coexist peacefully, that future wars were inevitable.
That really set off alarm bells in the West. Now, Russian historians later argued it was distorted, maybe deliberately by people like Kennan, but at the time it sounded like a declaration of ideological war, confirmed Western fears.
Which leads directly to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, March 46, that famous line.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. A powerful image. Churchill called for a Western alliance to stand up to Russia. Stalin shot back, of course, saw it as hostile, brought up his fears about Germany again, the need for Soviet security.
And by late 47, pretty much all of Eastern Europe, except Czechoslovakia, had communist governments. Rigged elections, secret police, Russian troops nearby, the works. Yugoslavia under Tito was the outlier, right? He resisted Stalin.
He did, because Tito's partisans had largely liberated Yugoslavia themselves. They weren't as beholden to Moscow. Now, Stalin could argue, and did, that he needed friendly governments for defense, that these countries weren't real democracies anyway, that communism would modernize them, but the methods, the sheer force involved, that's what horrified the West and pushed things further.
And pushed America to take a much stronger stance globally. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan.
Exactly. The Truman Doctrine, March 47. Britain couldn't afford to support the Greek government against communist rebels anymore. So Truman steps in. He says the U.S. will support free peoples who are resisting subjugation. Basically, will help anyone fighting communism anywhere.
Huge shift from American isolationism. Massive aid to Greece and Turkey followed.
It's a global commitment. Then the Marshall Plan, June 47. The economic arm. Billions in aid offered to help rebuild Europe. Officially, it was humanitarian, against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. But the political goal was clear. Stop communism from taking root in a desperate post-war Western Europe. Create prosperity, create stability, create allies.
But Lowe points out there are different views on the Marshall Plan's impact.
Yes, some American historians see it as this incredibly generous, vital thing that saved Europe. But some European historians are more skeptical. They argue Europe was already recovering, the aid wasn't that huge as a percentage of national income, maybe communist popularity was already falling, and that Stalin wasn't really planning to invade Western Europe anyway. He was focused on his buffer zone.
Either way, the Soviets saw it as hostile.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Molotov, the foreign minister, called it dollar imperialism, an American trick to control Western Europe. The USSR refused the aid, and crucially, they forced their satellite states to refuse it too, even Czechoslovakia, which had actually wanted to accept it.
And Stalin's response was the Common Form.
Common Form, September 47. An organization to pull all the European communist parties together, tighten Moscow's control, ensure they follow the Russian model, industrialization, collectivization, limited contact with the West. Then came Comecon, the economic equivalent, coordinating their economies, basically creating an Eastern Bloc counterweight.
Then came another shock for the West Czechoslovakia, February 48.
Yeah, that was a big one. Czechoslovakia was the last democracy left in Eastern Europe, a coalition government, freely elected. But the communists feared they'd lose the next election, maybe because rejecting Marshall aid hurt the economy. So they staged a coup, armed takeover. Non-communist ministers resigned. The foreign minister, Masaryk, turned up dead, called suicide, but widely believed and later proven to be murder. Rigged elections followed. Game over for democracy there. The West protested, but what could they do? No clear proof of direct Soviet invasion, though Russian troops were nearby. The Iron Curtain seemed truly sealed now.
And this economic divide, West Berlin thriving as this island of capitalism inside the poor Soviet zone, that led to the first major confrontation, didn't it? The Berlin Blockade.
It did. June 48 to May 49. Germany and Berlin were split 4 ways. The West poured Marshall aid into their zones, fostering recovery. Stalin stripped his zone of resources. Then the West introduced a new currency in their zones, including West Berlin. That was the trigger. Russia responded by cutting off all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, trying to starve the city out, force the West to leave.
But they didn't leave. They launched the Berlin airlift.
An incredible operation. For almost a year, American and British planes flew in everything: food, fuel, medicine. 247. 2 million tons of supplies, keeping 2.5 million West Berliners alive. Truman even moved B-29 bombers, the atomic carriers, to bases in Britain, a clear signal. The Russians didn't dare interfere with the flights.
And the blockade eventually failed.
Yeah, it did. Lifted in May 49. It was a massive propaganda win for the West, showed Soviet desperation. Yeah. But relations, rock bottom, and it directly led to NATO, and pretty much guaranteed Germany would stay divided.
NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed April 49. This was huge for the U.S., right? Abandoning that old no entangling alliances idea.
Absolutely historic. The U.S., Canada, Western European nations pledging mutual defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. Stalin naturally saw it as an aggressive military alliance aimed right at him. Tensions just ratcheted up again.
And then the division of Germany became official.
Yep, no hope for unity. The West created the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, in August 49. The Soviets responded with the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, in October. 2 Germanys locked into the Cold War until, well, 1989.
And then the nuclear fear factor ramped up massively.
September 49. The Soviets explode their own atomic bomb. Years earlier than the U.S. expected. The nuclear monopoly was over. The arms race was truly on. Truman immediately greenlights the H-bomb project, the hydrogen bomb, far more powerful. His advisors drafted NSC 68 in April 1950, secret report, called The Soviets Fanatics, recommended a massive military buildup, tripling defense spending.
Plus, Communist China was proclaimed in October 49, allied with the USSR by early 50. That must have terrified Washington.
It did. Added a whole new dimension to the communist threat, shifting the focus partly to Asia, which is exactly where the next hot war broke out. Korea, June 1950.
Okay, so relentless escalation. But then, after 1953, things seemed to cool down a bit. A partial thaw, as Lowe calls it. Why did that happen?
Several big reasons. First, Stalin died in March 1953. Huge. The new leaders, Malenkov, Bulganov, Khrushchev, they weren't Stalin. They actually seemed interested in easing tensions with the U.S.
And the H-bomb factor.
Crucial. By August 53, both sides had the hydrogen bomb. This created, nuclear parity, a balance of terror. Suddenly, all-out war meant mutually assured destruction. Both sides wiped out. That really forced everyone to step back from the brink. Khrushchev even talked about peaceful coexistence in '56, criticized Stalin, said it was either coexist or face the most destructive war in history. He still wanted communism to win, mind you, but through economics and influence, not necessarily war.
And in the U.S., McCarthyism was losing steam.
Yeah, Senator McCarthy's crazy anti-communist witch hunts were discredited by '54. That allowed for a slightly more moderate climate in the U.S., too.
So what were the actual signs of this thaw?
Well, the Korean War ended, July '53. The war in Indochina ended in '54. And in '55, the Soviets made some surprising moves. Gave up bases in Finland, stopped blocking new members at the UN, patched things up with Tito in Yugoslavia, even got rid of the common form, hinting maybe satellites could have a bit more freedom.
And Austria. That seems like a big one.
The Austrian State Treaty, May '55. Very significant. Austria had been divided like Germany, but now all occupying troops left. Austria became independent and neutral, couldn't join NATO or the European Economic Community. It showed maybe that countries could exist outside the two big blocs.
But you called it a partial thaw, so it didn't last.
No, not entirely. Lowe describes Khrushchev's policy as a curious mixture. He'd make friendly gestures, then crack down hard if he felt threatened. He never let go of Eastern Europe. Look at Hungary in '56. When they tried to break free, Soviet tanks rolled in, crushed the uprising brutally, no hesitation.
And the military alliances stayed.
Oh, yes. When West Germany joined NATO in '55, Khrushchev immediately responded with the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites, tit for tat. And the arms race kept going. Both sides kept building more nukes.
Berlin was still a problem, too.
Always Berlin. The West wouldn't recognize East Germany. Khrushchev tried to challenge Western rights in West Berlin again in '58. The U.S. pushed back. Then the U-2 incident in 1960. An American spy plane shot down deep inside Russia. Eisenhower refused to apologize. Khrushchev walked out of a summit. Things got frosty again.
Leading eventually to the Berlin Wall.
August 1961. East Germany was bleeding refugees. Millions had fled to West Berlin since '45. Khrushchev demanded the West get out of Berlin. Kennedy refused. So Khrushchev built a wall, literally overnight. A physical barrier sealing the escape route, the most brutal, concrete symbol of the Iron Curtain.
And all this simmering tension, plus the nonstop arms race. It leads us to the closest the world ever came to nuclear war, the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962.
Terrifying moment. The arms race had just kept accelerating. After the first A-bombs came the H-bombs, then ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Soviets got them first in '57, missiles that could reach the U.S. from Russia. The U.S. caught up fast with their Atlas missiles, then actually pulled ahead in numbers. But the U.S. also put shorter-range missiles, Jupiter and Thor, in Europe, and crucially in Turkey, right on the USSR's doorstep. Plus, the space race was on. Sputnik in '57 shocked the U.S. It was relentless technological competition.
And then Cuba gets drawn in. Castro takes power in '59.
Right. Castro overthrows the U.S.-backed dictator Batista, nationalizes American businesses, relations with the U.S. plummet, relations with the USSR improve dramatically.
And the Bay of Pigs invasion files in '61.
Yeah. Kennedy approves this CIA-backed attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. It's a disaster.
Yeah.
Castro declares Cuba socialist, Marxist. Kennedy keeps trying to destabilize him, so Castro asks Moscow for military help.
Which leads Khrushchev to make this incredibly bold, incredibly risky move, putting nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Why? What was he thinking?
Lowe suggests several motives. One, maybe to regain the lid, or parity, in long-range missiles, because the U.S. had those Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Khrushchev actually said something like, "The Americans surrounded us with bases. Now they'll know how it feels," a direct response to the missiles in Turkey. It was also a way to protect Castro, show solidarity, deter another U.S. invasion.
And maybe test the young President Kennedy, see how he'd react.
Probably part of it. Test his resolve. And maybe use the missiles as a bargaining chip, trade them for U.S. missiles out of Turkey, or maybe concessions on Berlin. It was gamble.
So October '62, U.S. spy planes spot the missile sites being built.
Pandemonium in Washington. Great consternation, as Lowe puts it. Military advisors pushed for airstrikes, invasion. But Kennedy, credit to him perhaps, chose a more measured path. Alerted troops, yes, but instead of attacking, he imposed a naval blockade, a quarantine around Cuba, and went public demanding the missiles be removed. For 13 days, the world held its breath. It genuinely felt like nuclear war could start any minute.
But they pulled back. How was it resolved?
Khrushchev blinked first, ordering Soviet ships heading to Cuba to turn back. Then came the deal. Publicly. Khrushchev removes the missiles from Cuba under UN supervision. Kennedy promises the U.S. will never invade Cuba. Secretly. Kennedy also agreed to remove those U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a crucial concession, though not revealed at the time.
What were the big outcomes of the crisis?
Huge relief, obviously, but also a sobering realization on both sides of just how close they'd come. It led to a real, if temporary, relaxation of tension. They set up the hotline, a direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin, to prevent misunderstandings in future crises. And in July '63, the U.S., USSR, and Britain signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, banning atmospheric tests. A small step, but significant.
Though Kennedy's handling, initially praised, was later questioned.
Yeah, later historians wondered if he'd missed a chance to get rid of Castro, or if his own actions, the Turkey missiles trying to destabilize Cuba, had actually provoked a crisis. And technically, Soviet ICBMs could already hit the U.S. from Russia. So the Cuban missiles were more about proximity and politics than a fundamentally new threat level, arguably.
And even after the scare, the arms race just kept going.
Relentlessly into the '70s. The Soviets were determined to catch up on ICBMs and especially submarine launch missiles, SLBMs. The U.S. got bogged down in Vietnam, which allowed the USSR to actually pull ahead in sheer numbers of missiles by the early '70s.
And the technology got even scarier. ABMs, MIRVs.
Right. Anti-ballistic missiles to shoot down incoming missiles. Then the U.S. develops MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. One missile, multiple warheads, hitting different targets, makes ABMs almost useless. The Soviets got MIRVs too, the SS-20. Then the U.S. developed cruise missiles, low-flying, hard to detect.
It just sounds insane. Enough weapons to destroy the world many times over.
That was the reality by the 1970s. Mutually assured destruction, Andy. The terrifying logic was that neither side would start a war because both would be destroyed. The constant danger, though, as Lowe notes, was one side thinking they could win with a surprise first strike.
Understandably, people started protesting this madness.
Yes, widespread public anxiety. In Britain, you had CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, starting back in '58. They wanted Britain to disarm unilaterally. Set an example, huge marches, demonstrations. British governments always resisted, saying it would leave them defenseless. They'd only consider multilateral disarmament, everyone doing it together. But the protests grew again massively in the 1980s across Europe, like the Green and Common Women's Peace Camp protesting U.S. cruise missiles in Britain and in the U.S. too. Yeah. People were terrified. And you could argue these movements did play a role. They put pressure on governments, helped push both sides towards negotiation towards the next phase.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway for you listening to this? This deep dive using Lowe's perspective shows these early Cold War decades were just dominated by intense ideology, deep suspicion, and this absolutely terrifying arms race that really did bring the world to the edge more than once.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Think about how those interpretations of history changed, from blaming Stalin to blaming the U.S. to this more complex idea of shared responsibility. What does that tell us about how we understand the past, especially when new evidence emerges? And maybe, just maybe, how could that help us think about current global tensions, where finding someone to blame is often the first and easiest step?